Welcome to Module 1, Lesson 10, the structure of ratio tables, additive and multiplicative. So today as we're going through this lesson, some of the things I'd like you to understand by the end would be how to identify the additive structure of a ratio table, identify the multiplicative structure of a ratio table, use the additive structure of a ratio table to make additional entries, use the multiplicative structure of a ratio table to make additional entries, and use ratio tables to solve problems. Right, so we have a couple different things that we're working on here today. Okay, you have an exploratory challenge that we're going to start with, and this is really the basis of the entire lesson. After this, you'll see that you'll have a problem that I would like you to try on your own. And when you come back to class, we'll go over that. So right here, we're going to look at these three tables, and we're going to imagine that we are taking a fruit salad. For every quart of blueberries we add, we need to put in 3 quarts of strawberries. We're going to create ratio tables, 3 of them, that show the amounts of blueberries and strawberries we would use if we need to make fruit salad for greater numbers of people. So the first table that we're working on is going to have amounts that are less than 10 quarts. And then here we are going to blueberries between 10 and 50 quarts. And then in table 3 we're going to do tables that contain greater than 100 quarts. All right, so what we're looking at here is we know that for every 1 quart of blueberries, so when it says just for every quart, we know that they mean 1. So for every 1 quart of blueberries, we add 3 quarts of strawberries. Well, I want you to take this opportunity to fill out the last couple of parts of table 1. You should use what you learned in lesson 9 in filling out ratio tables, and when you come back, we'll check your work. All right, so what this tells me is if I want to add 1 more quart of blueberries, I have to add 3 more quarts of strawberries, so 2 and 6, 3 and 9, 4 and 12, and 5 and 15. Okay, and we'll go into a little bit more detail with what these mean and how to use them momentarily. All right, so then for the next one, we want to do amounts of blueberries for 10 to 50 quarts. So if I have 10 quarts of blueberries, 20 quarts of blueberries, 30 quarts of blueberries, 40 and 50. And then for the third one, we want quantities that are greater than 100. So we'll start with 100 just to have a nice number to start with. And then we'll just go 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the information from the first table to help us figure out the other 2 tables. So in looking at this, we know that the ratio of blueberries to strawberries is 1 to 3. So for every 1 quart of blueberries, I need to have 3 quarts of strawberries. So I can take a look at this and I would know then that since it's 1 to 3, well, if I have 10 times as many blueberries, then I would need 10 times as many strawberries. So I know that I would need 30 strawberries. Okay, and then I know that if I have 20, so if you see here we have 1 and we went to 3, and then we have 10 to 30. And now here we have 2 and we're going to 20, so it's going to follow suit that we would use 60. Okay, and then 30 and 90, 40 and 120, 50 and 150. I want you to take a second and I want you to try to find the missing amounts of strawberries when we have 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500 blueberries. All right, so we would have to have 300 strawberries, 600 strawberries, 900 strawberries, 1,200 strawberries, and 1,500 strawberries. Okay, so filling out the tables we should be pretty good at this point. Now we're going to take a look at describing patterns that we see in the tables, and we want to be specific in our description. So I'm going to switch to typing here, and I'm going to pick a little bit nicer font for you guys so it's easier to see. And I want you to take a look at this for a second, and I want you to tell me, or I want you to think, what patterns do you see? So do you see any patterns going from left to right, up and down? Okay, and are they the same? So take a second and pause and take a look at what patterns you can find. All right, so if we look at this, we could say that the amount of strawberries is 3 times the amount of blueberries. Okay, so what I mean by this is for every 1 quart of blueberries that I put in, I'm going to put in 3 quarts of strawberries. So going from left to right, it's always times 3. It's always 3 times more. So that's 1. Okay, and did you notice, and that works for all 3 of these tables. Did you notice that for table 1, in your column of blueberries, you always added 1? Okay, so if we look here, this was +1, +1, +1, and +1. And then we had kind of the same deal over here, so we added the same amount each time, and then here we did +3, +3, +3, and +3. Notice we added the same thing every time, so we can also say that we added. And we want to be specific in talking about that it's in table 1. So in table 1, every time we added 1 quart of blueberries, we also added another 3 quarts of strawberries. Okay, and notice we added by 3 every time and we added by 1 every time. That never changed. Okay, and then you should notice that we had kind of the same idea when it came to the tens and the hundreds. So, but now instead we added by 10 each time. So when we have ratio tables, there's a lot of different ways that we can find the numbers that we're looking for. And then here, we didn't add by 3, we added 30 each time. And so on and so forth. So in our descriptions, we can say that in table 2, we added 10 quarts of blueberries each time, and then added 30 quarts of strawberries each time. And then we can say kind of the same thing for table 3. In table 3, each time we added 100 quarts of blueberries. We also added 300 quarts of strawberries. Okay, so we're really good at finding equivalent ratios when we're talking about multiplication and simplification, when we use simplification using division. Okay, but we also want to look at the other patterns that we see. So at this point, you should probably see that we have a pattern, an additive pattern as well. So there's additive and multiplicative. Additive is when you add to go from one number to the next, but you have to be adding the same thing in order for it to remain equivalent. Now, that doesn't mean I have to add the same thing to both sides. What that means is I have to add the same thing consistently. So every time I add 1 quart of blueberries, I have to add another 3 quarts of strawberries, because that's what the ratio is, 1 to 3. If I were to add 1 quart of blueberries and then 1 quart of strawberries, my ratio would be off. It would be 1 to 2 instead of 1 to 3. All right, so I'm going to move to my next page. We're going to look at the rest of the problems here. So for B, how are the amounts of blueberries and strawberries related to each other? So when you look at this, what's the relationship between the two? And we can say that the amount of strawberries is always 3 times the amount of blueberries, which is what we said earlier in our description. So the amount of strawberries is always 3 times the amount of blueberries. Okay, and we should also notice that every time it's always a ratio of 1 to 3. So it is always 3 times as much. So it's always, 1 times 3 is 3, 2 times 3 is 6, 10 times 3 is 30, 100 times 3 is 300. So it's always that the amount of strawberries is 3 times as much as the amount of blueberries. Okay. Even so, yes, we have that multiplicative comparison, but we should also notice that anytime that you take the value or reduce these ratios, that they are always, so the ratios are all equivalent to 1 to 3, which is what we said our original ratio was. All right, and then for C, how are the values in the blueberries column, now columns run up and down, related to each other? Okay, so we want to look at each of the patterns. So if you look here, we've talked about this, how every time you go up by the same amount. So we add 1. So in table 1, we add 1 each time because we're working with smaller amounts. In table 2, we are adding 10 each time. Okay, so we can use this comparison when we're adding the same amount. Like if we were to take this 10 and put it over here and put this 60 over here, these would all still be equivalent ratios, but we would not be able to use addition to help us figure out missing numbers in the table because it doesn't, 1 plus 1 isn't 10, 1 plus 9 is 10, and it isn't 10 plus 9 that gives you 3. So you really have to be careful and pay attention to what you're adding and make sure that you're adding the same amount each time in order to use addition to help you find your missing numbers. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just put all these pieces back where they once were so we can continue with using those properties that we are finding. So we can say that each time, or in each table, we're adding the same amount. So in each table, we are always adding the same amount of blueberries each time. Okay, so that's a good one to have. Okay, we could also, you could say that in a different way. You could say that each time, we add 1 in table 1 or in table 2, we always add 10. But in general, we can say that in each table, we're always adding the same amount of blueberries each time. So again, I'll write that out for you and show you that we are doing, so plus 1, plus 1, plus 1, plus 1. Okay, and here, plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, and over here, plus 100, plus 100, plus 100, and you guessed it, plus 100. Now notice, just because we're doing the same thing over here doesn't mean it's the exact same thing here. So we have to keep doing the same thing to that specific piece. So in this case, blueberries. So we have to keep adding 10 quarts of blueberries. We don't do that same thing to strawberries because it's not the same amount of strawberries that keeps the ratios equivalent. Okay, so that leads us to our next step when we're talking about our strawberries. So how are the values in the column of strawberries related to each other? Okay, and again, if you look and see, in each table, we are always adding the same amount of strawberries each time. Okay, so we talked about addition. Okay, you can also, so now we're looking at it and we're comparing just blueberries to blueberries. So for the first one, we looked at how to go from blueberries to strawberries. Now we're looking at how to go from strawberries to strawberries in each different composition of our fruit salad. Okay, so we have several different ways that we can find those missing values. So for E, if we know we want to add 7 quarts of blueberries to the fruit salad in table 1, how can we use a table to help us determine how many strawberries to add? Okay, well, this is quite simple. What we could do is we could just add on to our table. So we could make our table a little bit bigger and make it go to 7. Okay, so putting 6, and then we know that we'd have to add another 3, so that would be 18, and 7, and that would be 21. Okay, so we can add on to the table, and we could also, you know, kind of skip a step. We wouldn't have to stay with our pattern, we would want to do add 1, and since I add 1 here, I had to add 3 here because that's what I'm doing on this side. So every time I add 1 here, I add 3 over here. So when I added 1 to get to 6, I had to add 3 to get to 18. Okay, so I can use those patterns in my table to find my missing pieces as well. So for this one, we could continue our table to get to 7 quarts of blueberries to find the amount of strawberries. Okay. For F, if we know we use 70 quarts of blueberries to make our salad, how can we use the ratio table to find out how many quarts of strawberries were used? Okay, so we can use, again, we can continue this table up here, and we know that we can add 10 and then add 30 over here and add another 10 and add another 30. Or we can go back to our original table where we know that it was the ratio of 1 to 3, and we can use our multiplication. So we know that 1 to 3 tells me that for every 1 quart of blueberries, I multiply that by 3 and I put in that amount of strawberries. So I know that if I want to put in 70 quarts of blueberries, I'd have to multiply that by 3 to find out that I have to put in 210 quarts of strawberries. Okay, so that's how I can use multiplication, and then I can use addition. Again, and we could say here, I could use the tens table and continue to add by 10 until I get to 70 quarts of blueberries. Then I would have to continue to add by 30, and I would want to say here I'd have to continue to add my strawberries. Add my strawberries by 30, the same number of times that it took to get to 70 with my blueberries. Now I know this is, the verbiage of this is a little bit confusing, but basically what it's saying is that if you had to add, so if you started at 10 and you had to add 10 7 times to get to 70 to figure out your number of blueberries, then to find your number of strawberries, you would have to add 30 7 times to find your number of strawberries. Okay, so again here, to get to 50, I had to add 10. 1, 2, 3, 4. So started with 10, and then I added 1, 2, 3, 4 more 10s. So in starting with 30, I would have to add 1, 2, 3, 4 more 30s to figure out how many strawberries I would need. Okay. So what I would like you to do for class tomorrow is I would like for you to do exercise number 1. Okay, so the following tables were made incorrectly. Find the mistakes that were made, create the correct ratio table, and state the ratio that was used to make the ratio table. Okay, so I want you to try to use addition where you can, when you feel comfortable, to make these new tables. But in here somewhere, there are ratios, or maybe a ratio that is a mistake. You need to find that original ratio, write it down here, and then create a table that would be correct using that correct ratio. Now, just because this is the first one doesn't mean that it's necessarily correct. So you have to figure out which one of these is incorrect and then fix the mistakes. Right? So be careful and make sure that you're reading carefully when you're looking at your numbers. Again, I would like you to try to use addition where you feel comfortable, and we will be practicing in that in class when you come back. So make sure if you have any questions or if you are struggling that you write them down and be sure to bring them up in class tomorrow.